Hello, my name is Susan Stewart. I am the Assistant Director at the State Performance Plan Technical Assistance Project, or SPP-TAP for short. SPP-TAP is funded by the California Department of Education through a contract with Napa County Office of Education to provide technical assistance to local educational agencies in California that are significantly disproportionate. This recording, which is one of 4 introductory recordings, is about identification methodology for determining that local educational agencies are significantly disproportionate. Brandi Jauregui from the California Department of Education will be walking us through the methodology so that we understand what constitutes significant disproportionality and how that is measured.
My name is Brandi Jauregui, Information Technology Specialist with the Data Evaluation and Analysis Unit. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about significant disproportionality and some of the methodology behind it. Let's start with how LEAs are notified that they are significantly disproportionate. So every year in the spring, LEAs are going to be notified through the annual determination letters whether they are significantly disproportionate. Any LEA that is identified as significantly disproportionate will be notified through the annual determination letter. So when defining an LEA for purposes of disproportionality and significant disproportionality, the California Department of Education defines a local educational agency as any charter school, regardless of reporting or funding status, or a school district or county office of education identified as the District of Special Education Accountability in their certified data for the California Longitudinal Pupil Achievement Data System, otherwise known as CalPADS. So let's talk a little bit about the risk ratio. The Office of Special Education Programs does require that the California Department of Education calculate the risk ratio for each local educational agency. So when we talk about the risk ratio compares the risk of a specific outcome for one racial or ethnic group, which we refer to as the analysis group in an LEA, to the risk of the same outcome for all other students, which we call the comparison group. The comparison group excludes students in the analysis group, and we'll show you an example of this in a couple of slides. There are certain criteria that have to be met in order for a risk ratio to be calculated. Each area of risk has a numerator, which we refer to as the cell size, and a denominator, which we refer to as the n size. So the first criteria is that in order for the risk ratio to be calculated for the analysis group must have a minimum cell size of 10 and a minimum n size of 20. Otherwise, the risk ratio cannot be calculated. The calculation is not done. The second criteria is that if the comparison group has a cell size less than 10 or an n size less than 20, then the alternate risk ratio is used instead of that standard risk ratio that we just talked about. And then finally, for the alternate risk ratio calculation, if the state comparison group has a cell size less than 10 and a denominator less than 20, then the alternate risk ratio is not calculated. Federal regulations allow some flexibility when defining significant disproportionality. California, in this case, chooses to use a risk ratio threshold of 3.0. To be considered significantly disproportionate, an LEA must be disproportionate in the same areas, which is a combination of race, ethnicity, and category for 3 consecutive years. Reasonable progress is measured according to the following formula. So first, the LEA must have a calculated risk ratio or alternate risk ratio in the current year of 4.0 or less, and there must be a reduction in the risk ratio or alternate risk ratio over the prior 2 years of at least 0.5 each year. Now we're going to look at a specific calculation, a risk ratio calculation for African American students with disabilities with a primary disability of emotional disability. The first thing that we need to do is calculate the risk for the analysis group. And in this case, again, our analysis group is African American students with emotional disabilities. We do that by dividing the count of African American students with emotional disabilities by the total count of African American students in the LEA, then multiplying that number by 100, which results in a risk of 8.308. Because the non-African American counts are actually more than 10 and 20, which means the cell size is greater than 10 and the N size is greater than 20, then we can actually use the LEA counts for the comparison group. So next, we calculate the risk for the comparison group. All other students with emotional disability, excluding African American students with emotional disabilities. And we do that by dividing the count of all other students with emotional disability in the LEA to the total enrollment of all other races, ethnicities in the LEA. Then we multiply that number by 100, which results in a risk of 1.851. The final step in this process is dividing the African American risk by the total less African American risk, and we come up with a risk ratio of 4.49, which, as you can see, does exceed the risk ratio threshold. So now let's talk about the alternate risk ratio. So the alternate risk ratio calculation has to be used in cases where the cell size or the N size of the LEA comparison group does not meet the minimum cell size of 10 or the minimum N size of 20. So rather than using counts from the LEA, the alternate risk ratio uses statewide counts for that comparison group. Here's an example of the alternate risk ratio calculation. So first, again, we're going to calculate the risk for the analysis group. In this case, our analysis group is white students with disabilities with a primary disability of emotional disability. And we're going to start by dividing the count of white students with an emotional disability by the total count of white students in the LEA and multiplying that number by 100, which results in a risk of 1.465. Now, because the comparison group has a cell size less than 10, the alternate risk ratio has to be used, and that uses state level numbers for the comparison group counts. Next, we calculate the risk for that comparison group. The comparison group in this case is all other students with emotional disabilities, excluding the white students with emotional disability. And we divide the count of all other students with emotional disability in the state to the total enrollment of all other races, ethnicities in the state, and then multiply that number by 100, resulting in a risk of 0.331. Now, the final step, again, is to divide the white risk by the state total less the white students, and we come up with a risk ratio of 4.42, which, again, exceeds the state threshold of 3.0. So let's talk about where the data comes from. There are several categories for which disproportionality is calculated, and here are those areas. We've got overall disproportionality. We've got disproportionality by primary disability, disproportionality in placement, which in CalPAD's terminology means program settings and general education participation percentage. And then finally, disproportionality by discipline. So data for overall disproportionality, primary disability, and placement are drawn from the Fall 1 census data submission to CalPADS, or the California Longitudinal Pupil Achievement Data System. This is for students ages 3 to 21. The data for the total enrollment is also drawn from CalPADS certified enrollment counts that are in a different section in CalPADS, but it does come from the same source, the Fall 1 certified enrollment counts. Now, data for discipline disproportionality is actually drawn from the prior year's end of year 3 student incident data submission to CalPADS. Again, this is for students ages 3 to 21. And the students with disabilities count is drawn from the prior year's end of year cumulative enrollment counts. So this concludes this section of the presentation. If you do have specific questions on disproportionality or significant disproportionality, You can contact Stephen Rogers. He's an education programs consultant in the data evaluation and analysis unit at srogers@cde.ca.gov.
Thank you for listening to this recording. Your next steps are to finish watching the remaining recordings listed on this slide. The first recording provided some foundational information about the federal requirements around significant disproportionality and how California is addressing those requirements. You've just listened to the identification methodology recording, so that is done. And the remaining recordings in the series will give you an overview of what technical assistance is available to LEAs that are identified as significantly disproportionate in California, as well as a brief history of how comprehensive coordinated early intervening services to address significant disproportionality came into being and what we've learned along the way. You can access all of the recordings from the significant disproportionality page on the caltan.info website. On this slide, you'll see that we have an introductory webinar on February 18th, 10 to 11 a.m. These recordings that I've just mentioned are the pre-work for that event. So we encourage you to view all of the recordings prior to that event so that you will have this fundamental understanding of significant disproportionality prior to that meeting, where we will delve deeper into what this means for you and your LEA. There are two more events that I want to give you a heads up about. Both of them will have pre-recorded pre-work. The Step 1 workshop is an in-person event. These will be held throughout the state, and they will occur in February and March. Keep an eye out for an email with information about this event, who should attend, and which workshop to attend. The Step 2 workshop is a virtual event. There will be some pre-work that it will be recorded that you'll want to watch before that June 18th workshop. We look forward to seeing you at the introductory webinar. But in the meantime, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact the California Department of Education at SIGDISP, that's SIGDISP, at cde.ca.gov. Or you can contact us at the State Performance Plan Technical Assistance Project at SPP-TAP at napacoe.org. We look forward to seeing you on February 18th.